Hello, dear readers and mystery enthusiasts. How are you all doing today? I hope you're settling in with a warm cup of tea, perhaps by a cozy fireside, ready for a tale of intrigue and deception. Before we begin, let me ask you something intriguing. Have you ever wondered how well you truly know your closest friends? What secrets might they be hiding behind their smiles and polite conversations? It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The people we trust most could be strangers in disguise. Today's story explores exactly that. A tale of friendship, betrayal, inheritance, and murder, all set in the elegant but deadly world of 1920s England. Our beloved Miss Jane Marple finds herself drawn into a web of lies that has been spinning for over 40 years, where three women who call themselves friends are hiding secrets darker than anyone could imagine. If you enjoy classic mysteries in the style of Agatha Christie, with twists, turns, and that satisfying moment when all the pieces finally click into place, then you're in for a treat. But before we dive into this mystery, I have a small request. If you love stories like these, please do subscribe to stay updated with more thrilling mysteries and classic tales. Your support means the world and helps me bring you more content like this. Now then, let's begin our journey to Greenways Manor, where death lurks behind every polite smile, and friendship proves to be the most dangerous game of all. Chapter 1. The Letter from Greenways. The autumn morning arrived with a peculiar chill that seemed to seep through the very walls of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead. She sat in her customary chair by the window, knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the postman making his rounds. Mr. Briggs was precisely 3 minutes earlier than usual, a detail that did not escape her notice. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he called cheerfully, handing her a cream-coloured envelope through the garden gate. "Rather fancy post you've got today." The envelope was indeed unusual. Heavy linen paper, sealed with dark green wax bearing an ornate G. Miss Marple's keen eyes examined it carefully before slicing it open with her mother's silver letter opener. "Dear Miss Marple, I find myself in need of your particular wisdom. My aunt, Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, passed away at Greenways Manor 3 weeks ago. The circumstances, while ruled natural by our local physician, trouble me greatly. More disturbing still is the behaviour of those who claimed to be her dearest friends. Since the reading of the will, friendships of 40 years have dissolved into bitter accusations and strange hostilities. I recall you mentioning once that you had known Aunt Cordelia in your youth. I dare hope you might remember her fondly enough to visit. Something is terribly wrong here, Miss Marple, and I fear the truth may be darker than mere greed. Your devoted acquaintance, Eleanor Ashworth." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her blue eyes growing distant with memory. Cordelia Ashworth. Yes, she remembered her, a vivacious girl with copper hair and a laugh, like silver bells. They had been at the same finishing school in Switzerland, though Cordelia had been 2 years her senior. She had married well, very well indeed, to Harold Ashworth of the railway fortune. "Raymond," she called to her nephew, who was visiting for the week, "I shall need you to drive me to Greenways Manor in Sussex, tomorrow, if possible." Raymond appeared in the doorway, newspaper in hand. "Aunt Jane, surely not another one of your murder investigations?" She smiled gently. "Perhaps. Or perhaps merely the sad unravelling of human nature when money enters the equation. Though in my experience, The two are often indistinguishable. The following afternoon found them motoring through the Sussex countryside, where golden leaves drifted lazily from ancient oaks. Greenways Manor emerged from behind a row of towering elms, a Georgian masterpiece of red brick and white stone, its windows glinting in the pale sunlight like watchful eyes. Eleanor Ashworth greeted them at the door. She was a woman of perhaps 45, handsome rather than beautiful, with tired eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come. I confess I wasn't certain you would." "When old friends are troubled, my dear, one comes," Miss Marple replied, accepting the younger woman's hand. "Now, you must tell me everything, but first, who else is staying at the manor?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "The Vultures, as I've come to think of them. Aunt Cordelia's three closest friends, Mrs. Sylvia Pemberton, Mrs. Dorothy Blackwood, and Miss Henrietta Grace. They've all remained since the funeral, each claiming deep grief, each watching the others like hawks." As if summoned by the mere mention of their names, 3 women appeared in the entrance hall. They were all of a certain age, dressed in mourning black, each face a study in barely concealed hostility. "Eleanor," said the tallest, a regal woman with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, "you didn't mention we were expecting guests." "Mrs. Pemberton, may I present Miss Jane Marple, an old-school friend of Aunt Cordelia's?" Miss Marple observed the minute reactions. Mrs. Pemberton's slight stiffening, the sharp glance exchanged between the other 2 women, the way Miss Grace's fingers tightened on her handkerchief. "How lovely," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice suggesting it was anything but. "I'm sure Cordelia would have been delighted to see you again, though I must say, she never mentioned you in all our years of friendship. People often keep their past compartmentalized," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Rather like how we keep our true feelings hidden behind polite smiles, don't you think?" The tension in the hallway thickened like fog. Miss Marple smiled her most innocent smile and thought, yes, something is very wrong here indeed. Chapter 2. The Poison Garden. Miss Marple settled into the Rose Room, a charming chamber overlooking the manor's extensive gardens. Eleanor had placed her there deliberately, she suspected, as it offered an excellent vantage point for observation. Through the leaded windows, she could see the 3 women taking tea on the terrace below, their voices rising occasionally in sharp disagreement. "They sit together out of habit," Eleanor explained, bringing in a tea tray herself rather than summoning a servant. "But the warmth has gone. Before Aunt Cordelia died, they were inseparable. Bridge every Thursday, charitable committees, holidays to Bath. Now they can barely stand to be in the same room." Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea with steady hands. "Tell me about the will, my dear. That seems to be where the trouble began." Eleanor sank into a chair, her composure cracking slightly. "It was unexpected. Aunt Cordelia left each of them £10,000, which everyone anticipated. But the bulk of the estate, the manor, the investments, everything else, came to me. Not because I'm family, she made that clear in a letter, but because she trusted me to preserve what she had built." "And the 3 ladies expected more? Mrs. Pemberton certainly did." She and Aunt Cordelia had known each other since childhood. She made remarks constantly about promises made, understandings reached. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "But Miss Marple, there's something else. The day before Aunt Cordelia died, she summoned her solicitor and changed the will. The previous version left everything divided equally among the 4 of them." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. Indeed, that is most illuminating. The solicitor, Mr. Griffiths, had told me Aunt Cordelia seemed agitated. She told him she had finally seen clearly, and that friendship was merely a mask for something far uglier. Those were her exact words. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Dorothy Blackwood stood in the doorway, a plump woman with anxious eyes and trembling hands. "Forgive the intrusion, Eleanor. Have you seen my spectacles? I'm quite certain I left them in the conservatory, but they've vanished." "I'll help you look," Eleanor said, rising with obvious reluctance. When they had gone, Miss Marple rose and examined the room more carefully. She had not survived 70-odd years without learning that privacy was an illusion in households with secrets. Her sharp eyes noted the way the carpet showed marks where furniture had been recently moved. The faint scent of lavender that didn't match the room's rose potpourri. Someone had been here, searching. That evening, dinner was a strained affair. The dining room was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers, portraits of Ashworth ancestors staring down from gilded frames, silver gleaming on Irish linen. The four women arranged themselves with careful spacing, like chess pieces on a board. Miss Henrietta Grace, a thin woman with intelligent eyes and nervous hands, barely touched her consommé. "I still cannot believe Cordelia is gone. We were to travel to Florence this spring. She had been planning it for months." "She planned many things," Mrs. Pemberton said coldly. "Not all of them came to fruition. What exactly do you mean by that, Sylvia?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice held an uncharacteristic edge. "I mean precisely what I say. Cordelia was full of promises, to all of us." Miss Marple dabbed her lips with her napkin. "Forgive an old woman's curiosity, but how exactly did Mrs. Ashworth die?" Eleanor mentioned it was considered natural causes, sir. A heavy silence fell. Finally, Miss Grace spoke. "She took ill after our weekly bridge game. We thought it was merely indigestion. She had eaten heartily of the salmon. By morning, she was gone. Dr. Hastings said it was her heart." "Dr. Hastings is a fool," Mrs. Pemberton announced. "Cordelia's heart was perfectly sound. I told the police as much." "You involved the police?" Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her attention sharpened. "A formality only," Eleanor interjected quickly. "They found nothing suspicious. Dr. Hastings had been treating Aunt Cordelia for years. He knew her constitution." After dinner, Miss Marple requested a tour of the gardens. Eleanor accompanied her, grateful for the escape from the drawing-room, where the three women had retreated into hostile silence. The gardens were extensive, beautifully maintained despite the season. But it was a particular section, enclosed by a low hedge, that drew Miss Marple's attention. "Ah," she said softly, "a poison garden." Eleanor's eyes widened. "How did you know?" Aunt Cordelia was fascinated by botanical history. She grew monkshood, deadly nightshade, foxglove, all carefully labelled and locked behind that gate. She said it reminded her that beauty and danger often grew from the same root. Miss Marple examined the gate. The lock was secure, but the earth near the monkshood plant had been recently disturbed. "Tell me, Eleanor," she said quietly, "on the night your aunt died, who prepared the salmon?" "Mrs. Blackwood. She always did when they played bridge here. She prided herself on her cooking." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "Surely you don't think—" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that your aunt discovered something about one of her dear friends, something worth killing for. And I think that friendship, my dear, ended precisely where inheritance began." In the shadows of the terrace above, a figure watched them and then silently withdrew. Chapter 3. The Bridge Game. Miss Marple woke at dawn, as was her custom, The manor was silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, and the distant call of a wood pigeon. She dressed carefully in her lavender wool dress, and made her way downstairs, her keen eyes missing nothing. The fresh mud on the carpet near the garden door, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering where it shouldn't be, the way one of the portrait frames hung slightly askew. In the morning room, she found Miss Henrietta Grace already seated with tea and toast, staring out at the misty gardens with red-rimmed eyes. "Forgive me, Miss Marple. I didn't sleep well. I never do any more. Not since Cordelia." Her voice trailed off. "Grief is a heavy companion," Miss Marple observed, settling into a chair, "though sometimes guilt wears a similar face." Miss Grace's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Guilt? I don't know what you mean." "Don't you? I find that people often know precisely what they mean, even when they pretend otherwise." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You were very close to Mrs. Ashworth, I understand. 40 years of friendship." 42, actually. We met at a concert in Brighton. I was a music teacher then, barely making ends meet. Cordelia befriended me, included me in her circle. She changed my life entirely. Tears spilled down Miss Grace's thin cheeks. I owed her everything. And yet you remained for the will reading. If you loved her so dearly, wouldn't grief have driven you away from this place of sorrow? Miss Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We all have our reasons for staying, Miss Marple, even you." She fled from the room, leaving her breakfast untouched. Eleanor appeared shortly after, looking exhausted. "I heard voices. Is everything quite all right?" "Quite all right, my dear, though I wonder if you might show me where the bridge games took place. I find that rooms often tell stories their occupants would prefer to keep hidden." The card room was on the first floor, a cosy space with green baize wallpaper and a mahogany table positioned beneath a Tiffany lamp. The cards still sat in their holder, and the score pad remained on the side table, the last game frozen in time. Miss Marple studied the score sheet carefully. Mrs. Ashworth and Mrs. Pemberton were partners against Mrs. Blackwood and Miss Grace. Mrs. Ashworth's last recorded score was particularly high. Aunt Cordelia was an excellent player. She took bridge very seriously, kept detailed records of every game in ledgers going back decades. She always said you could judge character by how someone played cards. "Indeed, and where are these ledgers now?" "In her study. The police looked through them but found nothing of interest." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The police, my dear Eleanor, rarely know what to look for. Might I examine them?" The study was a revelation, a feminine space of pale green silk and walnut furniture, lined with books on botany, travel, and detective fiction. The bridge ledgers occupied an entire shelf, each leather-bound volume labelled by year. Miss Marple pulled down the most recent one and began to read. Her expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "Eleanor, did your aunt ever mention suspecting anyone of cheating?" "Cheating? At bridge? Good heavens, no. That would have been unforgivable in her eyes." "Precisely." Miss Marple pointed to a series of entries. "Yet look here. 6 months ago, the scores become irregular. Mrs. Pemberton's winning streak is statistically improbable. Then, 3 months ago, it stops abruptly. And here," she turned to the final entry, "the night of Mrs. Ashworth's death. Your aunt has written something in the margin." Eleanor leaned closer. In Cordelia's spidery handwriting were 2 words, "Mirror, mirror." What on earth does that mean? "I suspect," Miss Marple said slowly, That it means your aunt had discovered someone was signalling their partner. Bridge players who cheat often use mirrors or reflective surfaces to glimpse cards. It's a betrayal of the highest order among serious players. A voice from the doorway made them both start. Snooping through Cordelia's private papers, I see. Mrs. Pemberton stood there, imperious in black taffeta, her face carved from marble. I might have known Eleanor would bring in some doddering amateur to cast aspersions. Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Marple said pleasantly, I wonder if you might tell me about your brooch. Such an unusual piece. The crystal catches the light beautifully. Mrs. Pemberton's hand flew instinctively to the ornate brooch at her throat, a large piece with a convex crystal centre surrounded by jet beads. It was a gift. From my late husband. How fortunate! I imagine positioned just so at a card table, the crystal might reflect quite a bit. Rather like a small mirror, in fact. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Mrs. Pemberton's face strained of colour. How dare you, she whispered, how dare you come into this house and accuse me? I'm accusing no one, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Merely making observations, though I do wonder whether Mrs. Ashworth made similar observations, whether she confronted you about them, whether that confrontation occurred on the night she died. Mrs. Pemberton drew herself up to her full height. Cordelia was my oldest friend. I would never have harmed her. But you did cheat at bridge, and she discovered it. And friendship, Mrs. Pemberton, as the saying goes, ends where inheritance begins. Or, in this case, where betrayal begins. You know nothing. Mrs. Pemberton's composure shattered completely. Nothing of what passed between us. Nothing of the promises made and broken. Nothing of... She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she had said too much. On the contrary, Miss Marple said quietly, I know a great deal about friendship. And I know that true friends don't need to cheat to maintain the illusion of equality. They accept each other as they are. Mrs. Pemberton turned and swept from the room, her taffeta rustling like dry leaves. Eleanor sank into a chair. Do you really think she killed Aunt Cordelia over a bridge game? People have killed for less, my dear. Though I suspect there's more to this story than cheating at cards. The question is, what else did your aunt discover? And which of her three friends had the most to lose? Through the window, Miss Marple could see Mrs. Blackwood and Miss Grace walking in the garden, their heads close together in urgent conversation. The game, she thought, was only beginning. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Conservatory. The afternoon brought rain, a steady drumming against the windows that turned Greenways Manor into an island of lamplight and shadow. Miss Marple found herself alone in the conservatory, a magnificent glass structure filled with exotic plants that Mrs. Ashworth had collected over decades of travel. She was examining a particularly fine specimen of orchid when Mrs. Dorothy Blackwood appeared, carrying a watering can and wearing an expression of determined cheerfulness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ah, Miss Marple, I see you've discovered Cordelia's pride and joy. She spent hours here, talking to her plants as if they were children. Mrs. Blackwood began tending to a potted fern with shaking hands. I've been trying to keep them alive since... How thoughtful of you, Miss Marple observed, though I notice you're watering that fern rather heavily. Too much water can be as deadly as too little. Mrs. Blackwood set down the watering can with a clatter. Is that supposed to mean something, Miss Marple? Only what I said, my dear. Though I find that people often hear accusations where none are intended. A guilty conscience, perhaps. The plump woman's face crumpled. I didn't kill her. I know what everyone thinks, that I poisoned the salmon I prepared that night. But I didn't. I loved Cordelia. Love and murder are not mutually exclusive, I'm afraid. In fact, in my experience, they often go hand in hand. Miss Marple settled onto a wrought-iron bench. But I don't believe you poisoned the fish, Mrs. Blackwood. Hope flickered across the woman's face. You don't? The symptoms Eleanor described, sudden illness, death by morning, don't match food poisoning. They match something far more specific. Digitalis, perhaps, from the foxglove in the poison garden, or aconitine from the monk's hood. Mrs. Blackwood's hands flew to her throat. How would I have gotten into the poison garden? Cordelia kept it locked always. She was obsessive about it. An excellent question. Who had keys? Only Cordelia herself, and possibly her gardener, old Thomas Weatherby. He's been with the family for 40 years. Miss Marple filed this information away. Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood, why did you really stay after the funeral? Don't say grief. I've seen grief, and what you're experiencing is something else entirely. Fear, perhaps. The woman collapsed onto the bench beside her, tears streaming down her round cheeks. You're right, I'm terrified. Not of being accused of murder, though that's dreadful enough. I'm terrified of what Cordelia knew. About you. About all of us. The words burst out like a confession. Cordelia changed in those last months. She became suspicious, watchful. She hired an investigator from London, a discreet man who asked questions about our pasts, our finances, our families. She never said why, but we all knew we were being examined like specimens under glass. And what did this investigator discover about you? Mrs. Blackwood's voice dropped to barely a whisper. That I'm not really a widow. My husband isn't dead. He's in prison. Embezzlement and fraud. I've been living on the charity of friends for 15 years, pretending to be someone I'm not. If Cordelia had exposed me, I would have been ruined, cast out from society entirely. Yet she didn't expose you. She left you £10,000. I know. That's what haunts me. Why would she leave money to someone whose secrets she'd uncovered? Unless... Mrs. Blackwood's eyes widened. Unless she felt guilty about something. Unless she knew something worse about someone else. Before Miss Marple could respond, a scream pierced the air. A high, terrified sound that came from the upper floors. Both women rushed from the conservatory, joining Eleanor and Mrs. Pemberton in the main hallway. The scream came again, and they followed it up the grand staircase to the gallery, where portraits of the Ashworth family gazed down with oil-painted eyes. Miss Henrietta Grace stood frozen before one particular portrait, her face white as parchment, pointing with a trembling finger. It was the portrait of Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth herself, painted perhaps 10 years earlier, showing her in an evening gown of peacock blue, her copper hair elegantly styled, her smile enigmatic, as someone had slashed the canvas diagonally across the throat. Who would do such a thing? Eleanor gasped, tears starting in her eyes. But Miss Marple was examining the portrait frame carefully. Behind it, barely visible, was a small wall safe that the painting had concealed. When was this discovered? She asked calmly. Just now, Miss Grace whispered. I came up to look at her face. I've been doing that every day since she died, but today I found it like this. And you saw no one? No one. The gallery was empty. Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. Did you know about this safe? No, I had no idea. Then I suggest we open it. Do you have your aunt's keys? Eleanor fumbled with the keyring she'd been carrying since her aunt's death. The third key fit, and the safe swung open with a soft click. Inside were several items, a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon, a small leather journal, and a velvet pouch that clinked with the sound of jewellery. Miss Marple reached for the journal, but Mrs. Pemberton snatched it first. "If there are secrets here, we all have a right to know them," she declared, her voice shaking. She opened the journal and began to read aloud. "June 15th, I have made a terrible discovery. The investigator's report confirms what I suspected. One of my dearest friends is not who she claims to be. The question now is what to do with this knowledge. Can friendship survive such deception? July 3rd, I confronted her today. She denied everything, but I saw the truth in her eyes. 40 years of friendship, built on lies. My heart is broken. August 20th, I have decided I will change my will. None of them deserve what I intended to leave. Only Eleanor has shown true loyalty. But I will give them each enough to survive. A final act of mercy, or perhaps weakness. September 29th, the final game. Tomorrow night, I will tell them all what I know. I will give them one chance to confess, to beg forgiveness. If they refuse, I will go to the police. Some things are unforgivable." The entry ended there. September 29th was the night Cordelia Ashworth died. Mrs. Pemberton's hands trembled as she lowered the journal. She planned to expose us all. "Not all of you," Miss Marple said quietly. "Only one. But which one?" She picked up the bundle of letters and carefully untied the ribbon. They were old, yellowed with age, written in a masculine hand. She scanned the first few lines and then looked up at the three women with knowing eyes. "I believe," she said softly, "it's time for the truth, all of it, starting with you, Miss Grace. These letters are addressed to someone named Harriet Pemberton, but you're Henrietta Grace. Or are you?" Miss Grace's thin face seemed to collapse in on itself. "Oh, God," she whispered. She knew everything. Chapter 5. The Sister's Shadow. Miss Henrietta Grace sank to her knees on the Persian carpet. Her composure shattered completely. The letters scattered from Miss Marple's hands like autumn leaves, each one a fragment of a secret 40 years in the keeping. "I'm not Henrietta Grace," she whispered. "I'm Harriet Pemberton, Sylvia's younger sister." Mrs. Pemberton, Sylvia, stood rigid as a statue, her aristocratic face revealing nothing, but her hands clenched so tightly that her gloves strained at the seams. Eleanor looked between the two women in confusion. "But that's impossible. You're not sisters. You look nothing alike. You have different surnames." "Half-sisters," Harriet corrected, her voice hollow. "Same father, different mothers. When father died, everything went to Sylvia and her mother, the money, the house, the respectability. My mother was the housemaid he'd seduced. I was the shameful secret, shipped off to relatives in Yorkshire with barely enough to survive." Miss Marple picked up one of the letters, scanning it quickly. "These are from your father to your mother. Love letters, promising marriage, promising legitimacy for you. Promises he never kept. He kept me hidden," Harriet continued, tears streaming down her face. "Even on his deathbed, he wouldn't acknowledge me. But Sylvia knew. She'd always known about me." All eyes turned to Mrs. Pemberton, who finally spoke, her voice like ice cracking. "Of course I knew. Father's guilty conscience manifested in every letter he wrote, every mysterious sum of money sent north. But I never told anyone. What would have been the point? It would only have created scandal." "So you allowed your half-sister to live in poverty," Miss Marple observed, "while you married well and enjoyed society." "I didn't allow anything," Sylvia snapped. "Harriet made her own choices. If she wanted a better life, she should have worked for it, not—" She stopped abruptly. "Not what?" Eleanor asked. "Not befriended Aunt Cordelia under false pretenses?" Harriet looked up, her face streaked with tears. "When I met Cordelia at that concert in Brighton 42 years ago, I didn't plan it. It simply happened. She was kind to me, the first person in my life who'd shown me genuine warmth. But then I discovered she was Sylvia's childhood friend, and I saw an opportunity." "An opportunity for revenge," Miss Marple said gently. "To insert yourself into your half-sister's world, to share in the friendship and comfort that should have been partly yours by birthright." "Yes," Harriet stood, her thin frame shaking with emotion. "Is that so terrible? I changed my name, created a new past, and became Henrietta Grace, music teacher. Cordelia never knew. Sylvia never told her. For 40 years we played this peculiar game. 3 friends, 2 of them sisters, who pretended to be strangers." Mrs. Pemberton's mask finally cracked. "You think it was easy for me? Watching you worm your way into Cordelia's affections, knowing I couldn't expose you without exposing Father's indiscretion. Every bridge game, every tea party, every holiday. I had to smile and pretend we were merely acquaintances when we shared the same blood." "But something changed," Miss Marple interjected. "Mrs. Ashworth hired an investigator. She discovered the truth." "She confronted me 6 weeks before she died," Harriet admitted. "She'd found birth records, matched dates, connected the pieces. She was furious, not because of who I was, but because I'd lied for so long. She said friendship without honesty was worthless." "And yet she didn't expose you," Eleanor said slowly. "She could have humiliated you, cut you off completely. Instead, she left you £10,000. Because Cordelia was fundamentally decent," Mrs. Pemberton said bitterly. "Even in betrayal, she couldn't bring herself to destroy someone. It was her greatest strength and her greatest weakness." Miss Marple walked to the window, gazing out at the rain-soaked gardens. But if Mrs. Ashworth had forgiven Miss Grace, or should I say Miss Pemberton, why the dire tone in her journal? Why write about unforgivable things and going to the police? She turned back to face the assembled group. "Because, my dears, Miss Grace's deception wasn't the worst secret in this house. It was merely the first domino. Mrs. Ashworth must have suspected that if one friend had been lying for 40 years, perhaps the others had secrets too. Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood, did Cordelia confront you about your imprisoned husband?" Mrs. Blackwood nodded miserably. 2 weeks before she died. She said she understood why I'd hidden it, that society's judgment was often cruel. She forgave me. 3 friends, 3 secrets uncovered, 3 confrontations, 3 forgivenesses. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room. And yet Mrs. Ashworth wrote that some things were unforgivable, which means there was a 4th secret, something far worse than a false identity or a hidden husband, something worth killing to protect. The rain drummed harder against the windows. In the silence that followed, Miss Marple heard footsteps approaching, heavy, masculine footsteps that didn't belong to any of the women present. The door opened, and a tall man in a dripping mackintosh entered. He was perhaps 60, weathered and strong, with the calloused hands of someone who worked outdoors. His eyes, however, were intelligent and sad. "Begging your pardon, Miss Eleanor," he said, removing his cap. "I'm Thomas Weatherby, the head gardener. I heard the commotion from the greenhouse. I think it's time I spoke up about what I saw the night Mrs. Ashworth died." Every woman in the room seemed to stop breathing. "You see," Thomas continued, his voice heavy with regret, "I was working late in the poison garden that night, preparing cuttings for the winter. The gate was unlocked because I had the key. And I saw one of you ladies enter the garden and take something from the monkshood plant." "Who?" Eleanor demanded. Who did you see?" Thomas Weatherby looked at each woman in turn, his expression sorrowful. "I'm sorry, miss, but I can't rightly say. It was dark and the lady wore a hooded cloak. All I can tell you is this. She moved like she knew exactly what she was looking for. And when she left, she was carrying a small vial, the kind Mrs. Ashworth used for her botanical specimens." Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. A hooded figure, purposeful movement, knowledge of the poison garden's layout. Which of these three women fit that description? But before she could voice the question, the lights suddenly went out, plunging the gallery into darkness broken only by the grey afternoon light from the windows. Someone screamed. There was the sound of a struggle, something heavy falling. When Eleanor managed to light a candle, they found Mrs. Pemberton unconscious on the floor, blood seeping from a wound on her temple. And the journal, Cordelia Ashworth's journal with its damning entries, had vanished completely. Chapter 6. The Gardener's Tale. Dr. Hastings arrived within the hour, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers and an air of self-importance that Miss Marple instantly distrusted. He examined Mrs. Pemberton in the drawing-room where they had carried her, tutting and muttering while the others waited anxiously. "A glancing blow to the temporal region," he pronounced finally. "She'll have a fearsome headache when she wakes, but no permanent damage. Someone struck her from behind. A calculated attack, not meant to kill, but to incapacitate." "And to steal the journal," Miss Marple added quietly. Eleanor had already sent for the police, but the rain had turned the roads to rivers of mud. Inspector Davies from the village wouldn't arrive until morning at the earliest. They were trapped in the manor with a thief, and possibly a murderer. Mrs. Pemberton regained consciousness as the evening drew in. She lay on the chaise longue, a cold compress on her head, her usual hauteur replaced by genuine fear. "I didn't see who struck me," she said weakly. "One moment I was standing there, trying to process Harriet's confession. The next, everything went dark. When the lights went out, I felt a hand on my shoulder, then nothing." "The person who attacked you must have planned it," Miss Marple mused. "They cut the electrical supply deliberately to create confusion, which means they knew the layout of the house, where the fuse box was located." "That could be any of us," Mrs. Blackwood said nervously. "We've all visited this house countless times over the years." "But only one of you was desperate enough to risk assault to retrieve that journal. What was on those remaining pages that we didn't read? What secret was worth such violence?" Thomas Weatherby had been invited to join them, sitting uncomfortably on the edge of a chair, his cap twisted in his work-roughened hands. Miss Marple turned her attention to him now. "Mr. Weatherby, you said you've been gardener here for 40 years. You must have known Mrs. Ashworth very well indeed." "Aye, miss. I started when I was barely 20, and Mrs. Ashworth was a new bride. I've tended these gardens through every season since. Then perhaps you can tell us about the poison garden. Mrs. Ashworth was very particular about it, I understand. Who else knew its secrets?" The old gardener's weathered face creased with thought. "Well, Mrs. Ashworth herself, of course. She was a scholar of poisonous plants, knew their properties, their histories. She'd give lectures at the Botanical Society sometimes. As for the other," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Mrs. Blackwood took an interest. She'd often walk there with Mrs. Ashworth, listening to her explain the various specimens." Mrs. Blackwood went pale. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing, ma'am. Only stating facts. You were interested in the plants. You asked questions about their preparation, their effects. Mrs. Ashworth thought you might write a book about them some day. She encouraged it." "This is absurd," Mrs. Blackwood's voice rose in panic. Yes, I was interested in botany. Is that a crime? No, Miss Marple said gently, but knowledge of poisons combined with opportunity creates suspicion. You prepared the salmon that night. You had access to the poison garden, at least through your friendship with Mrs. Ashworth. And you had a secret you desperately wanted kept hidden. But she forgave me. Cordelia forgave me about my husband. Did she? Miss Marple's blue eyes were shrewd. Or did she say she understood, which is not quite the same thing? Sometimes people claim forgiveness when they're still deciding what to do. Eleanor intervened, her voice strained. Miss Marple, surely we should wait for the police. This is becoming accusatory. Murder, my dear, is inherently accusatory. And we must face facts. Someone in this house poisoned your aunt. Someone who knew about the poison garden, who had opportunity that evening, and who is now desperate enough to commit assault to retrieve evidence. She turned to Harriet Grace, who had been sitting in frozen silence since her revelation. Miss Grace, or Miss Pemberton, as we now know, you've been quiet. What are your thoughts? Harriet looked up, her eyes red from crying. I'm thinking that Cordelia was right. Friendship ends where secrets begin. We were never really friends, any of us. We were conspirators, each hiding our true selves, using each other for comfort or status or revenge. Her voice broke. I loved her, you know. Despite everything, despite using her at first to hurt Sylvia, I grew to genuinely love Cordelia. And now she's dead, and I never got to tell her the truth from my own lips. Perhaps you did tell her, Miss Marple suggested softly. On the night she died. Perhaps you went to her after the bridge game, confessed everything, and she refused to forgive you as completely as you'd hoped. Perhaps you panicked. No. Harriet leapt to her feet. I wasn't even here that night. I left immediately after the game ended, before dinner. I went home. My landlady can vouch for me. Mrs. Henderson at Primrose Cottage. I was there by 8 o'clock. That's true, Eleanor confirmed reluctantly. Aunt Cordelia mentioned that Henrietta, Miss Grace, had left early, claiming a headache. Miss Marple filed this information away. Mr. Weatherby, what time did you see the hooded figure in the poison garden? Must have been around 9:30, miss. After dark, but before the house settled for the night. And Mrs. Ashworth took ill when? Around midnight, Eleanor said. I was awakened by her bell. By the time I reached her room, she was in terrible distress, sweating, vomiting, her heart racing. Dr. Hastings was summoned, but by dawn... Her voice failed. Dr. Hastings cleared his throat. The symptoms were consistent with cardiac arrest. Mrs. Ashworth had been under considerable stress. That much was evident from her demeanour in the weeks before her death. Stress can trigger, or mask, Miss Marple interrupted, the symptoms of poisoning. Aconitine from monkshood, for instance, causes rapid heartbeat, vomiting, and ultimately cardiac arrest. In an older person with a stressful situation, it might easily be mistaken for natural causes. Unless, of course, one were looking for poison specifically. The doctor bristled. Are you questioning my professional judgment? I'm questioning everyone's judgment, doctor, including my own. But I cannot ignore the evidence. A poison garden with disturbed earth, a hooded figure seen taking something from that garden, a woman dead within hours of a final confrontation, and a journal stolen to prevent us from learning some crucial truth. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. In the flickering light, each face looked capable of murder. Thomas Weatherby spoke again, his voice heavy. There's something else I should mention. About 2 days before Mrs. Ashworth died, I found something odd in the garden shed. One of the small vials was missing from the locked cabinet where we kept specimens. Only Mrs. Ashworth and I had keys to that cabinet. Or someone who knew where the keys were kept, Miss Marple said. Someone familiar enough with the household to know its secrets. Tell me, Mr. Weatherby, in 40 years of service, you must have observed a great deal. The comings and goings, the relationships, the tensions. What did you observe about Mrs. Ashworth's friendship with these 3 ladies? The old gardener looked uncomfortable. It's not my place to gossip about my betters, miss. Your mistress is dead, possibly murdered. This is far beyond gossip. He sighed deeply. If you must know, I always thought there was something strained about their friendship, like a rope pulled too tight. Mrs. Ashworth was generous, kind even, but she was also a woman who valued honesty above all. These last months, I could see it eating at her, the feeling that she'd been deceived. She told me once that she was tired of wearing masks, tired of pretending things were well when they weren't. Did she mention anyone specifically? Thomas hesitated, then spoke quietly. She said something strange, about a week before she died. She was in the poison garden, staring at the monk's hood, and she said, even the deadliest flower can look innocent in the right light. That's what makes them so dangerous. They're beautiful until they kill you. The room fell silent. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain continued its relentless assault on the windows. Miss Marple stood, her decision made. Eleanor, I'll need to examine your aunt's bedroom. The scene of her death may yet tell us something the living will not. Chapter 7. The Locked Room. Cordelia Ashworth's bedroom remained untouched since her death, preserved like a shrine by Eleanor's reluctance to disturb her aunt's final sanctuary. Miss Marple entered with a candle, as Eleanor preferred not to use the electric lights in this room, and the old woman's sharp eyes began their methodical examination. The chamber was elegant but not ostentatious. Pale blue wallpaper with silver filigree, a 4-poster bed with heavy damask curtains, a writing desk positioned by the window overlooking the gardens. Everything spoke of taste, refinement, and a woman who valued beauty but not excess. Tell me exactly what happened that night, Miss Marple requested, settling into the chair by the escritoire. Eleanor stood by the door, reluctant to enter fully. I was awakened by Aunt Cordelia's bell around midnight. She rang it frantically. I could hear it echoing through the corridors. When I reached her, she was sitting up in bed, clutching her chest. Her face was grey, and she was perspiring terribly. Did she speak? She tried. She kept saying something about the game, and I should have known. I thought she meant the bridge game earlier that evening. Then she said something that made no sense at all. She grabbed my wrist and whispered, "The Queen was always the deadliest piece." After that, she began convulsing. I rang for Dr. Hastings immediately, but by the time he arrived— "The room was locked from the inside when you arrived." "No, Aunt Cordelia never locked her door. She said she'd feel trapped if she did." Miss Marple stood and examined the water carafe on the bedside table. It was still half full, the glass beside it showing the faint residue of whatever had been drunk. She sniffed carefully. Nothing unusual, just water with perhaps a hint of lemon. "Was this water here when you found her?" "Yes. Aunt Cordelia always kept water by her bed. She suffered from dry mouth at night." "And who filled this carafe?" Eleanor frowned, thinking. "The maid would have done it as part of turning down the bed. That would have been around 7 o'clock before dinner." So the water sat here for 5 hours before Mrs. Ashworth drank from it. Ample time for someone to add something to it. Miss Marple moved to the writing desk, examining the papers scattered across its surface. Your aunt was writing something. Look, the pen is still uncapped. Ink dried on the nib. She was interrupted. The paper showed the beginning of a letter in Cordelia's distinctive handwriting. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then my suspicions have proven correct, and I have paid the ultimate price for my curiosity. I should have gone to the police immediately, but I wanted to give her one final chance to confess, to explain why she had. The letter ended there, the final word trailing off into an ink blot. Her, Miss Marple murmured. She wrote her. So Mrs. Ashworth knew her killer was a woman, and she was giving this person one final chance to confess before going to the authorities. But confess to what? Eleanor asked desperately. What could be worse than the secrets we've already uncovered? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was examining the bookshelf beside the bed, running her fingers along the spines as medical texts, botanical references, travel memoirs, and, she paused, several detective novels by Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, and Marjorie Allingham. Your aunt enjoyed detective fiction. She adored it. She said the puzzle of a mystery was like the puzzle of human nature. You had to pay attention to the smallest details to solve either one. How very wise. Miss Marple pulled out one of the books, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and several loose papers fell from between its pages. They were newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, all dated from 42 years ago. The headlines made Eleanor gasp. Brighton boarding house fire kills 3. Arson suspected in tragic blaze. Survivor speaks. I saw her set the fire. Miss Marple read the articles carefully, her expression growing graver with each paragraph. The fire had occurred at a respectable boarding house on the Brighton seafront in late 1883. 3 people had died. An elderly landlady, her invalid son, and a young maid. The sole survivor had been another boarder, a woman who had been visiting the theatre that evening. The survivor's name had been withheld, but she had given testimony that she'd seen one of the other boarders, a woman in her late 20s, tampering with the gas lamps earlier that day. However, this woman had disappeared before the police could question her, and the case had eventually gone cold. Brighton, Eleanor whispered. That's where Aunt Cordelia met Miss Grace, or Miss Pemberton, as we now know, at a concert in Brighton 42 years ago. Indeed, and where there's one Pemberton sister, might there not have been another? Mr. Weatherby, you mentioned that Mrs. Pemberton, Sylvia, had known your mistress since childhood. Where did they meet? Thomas Weatherby, who had followed them upstairs, stood in the doorway. In Surrey, miss. Both their families had estates near Guildford. They were childhood playmates, became inseparable as young ladies. And yet Mrs. Ashworth moved to Brighton for a time in her youth, did she not? Before her marriage? Aye, that's right. Her father sent her to Brighton for a season, to take the sea air and attend concerts and such. That's where she met Mr. Ashworth, in fact. He was visiting from London. Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly, connecting pieces. So Cordelia Ashworth was in Brighton 42 years ago, the same time as this catastrophic fire. She meets Henrietta Grace, who is actually Harriet Pemberton, the illegitimate half-sister of her childhood friend Sylvia. But perhaps Cordelia also encountered someone else in Brighton, someone who was running from a terrible crime. She turned to Eleanor. These clippings were hidden in a detective novel. Your aunt was trying to solve a real mystery, not just read about fictional ones. The question is, which of the 3 women was in Brighton at the time of this fire? A voice from the doorway made them all start. Mrs. Blackwood stood there, her plump face pale as parchment, her hands twisting her handkerchief into knots. "I was," she said quietly. "I was in Brighton when that fire happened. I was 23 years old, newly arrived from my family's farm in Devon, trying to make my way as a cook in service. I was staying at that very boarding house." The silence was absolute. "I didn't set the fire," Mrs. Blackwood continued, her voice breaking. "I swear on my life I didn't, but I knew who did. I saw her that night, before I went to the theatre, tampering with the gas lamps in the hallway, her face twisted with rage. When I came back and saw the flames, I knew, but I never told anyone." "Why not?" Eleanor demanded. "Because I was terrified. The woman who set the fire, she saw me watching her. She cornered me in the street the next day and threatened me. She said if I ever spoke a word to the police, she'd make sure I burned next. She had these eyes, you see, cold and empty, like looking into a well with no bottom. I believed her, so I kept silent, and she disappeared, and I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't," Miss Marple said softly, "because years later you met this woman again. At one of Mrs. Ashworth's gatherings, perhaps, at a bridge game or a charitable function. And you recognized her, even though she'd changed her name, her appearance, her entire life." Mrs. Blackwood nodded miserably. "Not at first. It was 20 years before I realized who she was. She'd aged, of course, and styled herself differently. But then one day, I saw that look in her eyes again, that cold, empty look, and I knew I was having tea and playing cards with a murderess." "And did you tell Mrs. Ashworth?" "No, I was too frightened. This woman had killed 3 people without remorse. What would she do to me if I exposed her? So I kept silent again, like the coward I am. But Cordelia was clever. She must have suspected something. She hired that investigator, and he dug up the Brighton fire. She confronted me about why I'd never mentioned living there, why I'd hidden that part of my past." "And you told her the truth?" "I had to. She already knew too much. I told her everything about the fire, about seeing the woman, about keeping silent for 40 years. Tears streamed down Mrs. Blackwood's round cheeks. Cordelia was horrified. She said she had to go to the police, that justice had to be served no matter how much time had passed. But she wanted to give this woman one chance to confess, to show remorse. She arranged a final bridge game, the night she died." Miss Marple felt the pieces clicking into place with terrible certainty. "And this woman, this arsonist who killed 3 people and has been hiding in plain sight for 42 years, which of Mrs. Ashworth's friends is she?" Mrs. Blackwood opened her mouth to answer, but a figure appeared behind her in the hallway, moving with deadly purpose. It was Harriet Grace, and in her trembling hands she held a letter opener pointed directly at Mrs. Blackwood's back. "I'm so sorry, Dorothy," Harriet whispered, her voice strange and distant, "but you've said quite enough. Chapter 8. The Queen's Gambit. Miss Grace, put down that letter opener immediately." Miss Marple's voice was calm but commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Harriet's hand trembled violently, the pointed steel wavering in the candlelight. Her face was a mask of anguish, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "You don't understand. You don't understand what it's been like, living with this secret, watching and waiting." "Then help us understand," Miss Marple said gently, taking a careful step forward. "Is Mrs. Blackwood telling the truth? Were you the woman who set that fire in Brighton?" "No." The word came out as a sob. "Not me, never me, but I knew. God help me. I've known for 20 years, and I've said nothing." Eleanor moved slowly toward the bell pull, but Harriet's wild eyes caught the motion. Please, don't call anyone yet. You need to hear the whole truth. All of us have been living in lies, but the worst lie of all is still hiding in this house." Mrs. Blackwood turned slowly to face Harriet, her fear giving way to confusion. "If not you, then who? Harriet, who set that fire?" "My sister." The words fell like stones into deep water. "My half-sister, Sylvia Pemberton, the woman you all know as Mrs. Pemberton, the respectable widow, the pillar of society." The accusation hung in the air, impossible and yet horribly plausible. "That's absurd," Eleanor protested. "Mrs. Pemberton has been Aunt Cordelia's friend since childhood. She couldn't possibly—" "Childhood friends who lost touch," Harriet interrupted, lowering the letter opener slightly. "When Sylvia's mother married again and moved to London when Sylvia was 16, they didn't reconnect until 5 years later, when Sylvia was 21 and living in Brighton under her married name. Cordelia didn't even know Sylvia had married. The marriage was brief, brutal, and hushed up by the family. The man was a drinker and a brute." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And this husband, was he one of the victims of the fire?" Harriet nodded slowly. Edmund Thorne was his name. He'd been injured in a factory accident and was bedridden in that boarding house, cared for by the landlady's son. Sylvia visited him dutifully every week, playing the devoted wife, but I knew, because I followed her one night, that she was planning to leave him, to run away with a gentleman she'd met at the assembly rooms, a gentleman with money and prospects who didn't know she was already married. So she set the fire to free herself, Thomas Weatherby said quietly from his corner, killed her husband and made it look like an accident. It was supposed to be only him. Harriet's voice broke. She told me later, years later, when I finally confronted her, that the landlady and the maid weren't supposed to be there. They died because they came back early from an errand, but Sylvia felt no remorse. She said they were collateral damage, necessary sacrifices for her freedom. And you kept her secret, Miss Marple said. Why? Harriet's laugh was bitter. Because she was my sister, the only family I had left, however much she despised me. Because she threatened to expose me as the illegitimate daughter if I spoke out, to ruin any chance I had of a decent life. Because I was young and frightened and foolish, take your pick. But you took a new name and followed her, Eleanor said slowly, understanding dawning. You became Henrietta Grace and inserted yourself into her social circle, not just for revenge against her rejection, but to watch her, to make sure she never killed again. Yes, for 42 years, I've been her shadow, her conscience, her jailer without bars. Every friendship she made, I made. Every social circle she entered, I entered. I watched her like a hawk watches a snake. Harriet's face crumpled. But I failed. I failed Cordelia. Because Mrs. Ashworth discovered the truth, Miss Marple said. The investigator found the records of Sylvia's first marriage to Edmund Thorne, traced the fire, connected the pieces. And when she confronted Sylvia, Sylvia killed her. The voice came from the doorway, cold and controlled. Mrs. Pemberton stood there, perfectly composed despite the bandage on her head, her eyes as empty as the winter sea. Yes, I killed her. I put aconitine from the poison garden into her water carafe while she was at dinner. I watched her drink it before the bridge game, knowing it would take hours to work. and when she began to feel ill, I bid her good night and went to my room, secure in the knowledge that by morning my secret would be safe. The confession was delivered with such chilling calm that it seemed to freeze the very air. Even Miss Marple, who had suspected the truth, felt a shiver run down her spine. "Sylvia, no," Harriet whispered. "Please, tell them it's not true." "But it is true, dear sister, all of it." Mrs. Pemberton stepped fully into the room, her posture regal despite the circumstances. Edmund was a mistake I corrected with fire. Cordelia was a threat I eliminated with poison. I have no regrets about either. They stood in the way of the life I deserved. "The life you stole," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "You murdered my aunt. You murdered 3 innocent people in Brighton. You've been a monster, hiding behind respectability for 42 years. "I've been a survivor," Mrs. Pemberton corrected coldly. "Do you know what it's like to be trapped in a marriage with a man who drinks away your dowry and beats you when the bottle runs dry? To watch your prospects fade while illegitimate half-sisters are coddled with secret money. I took what I needed to survive, and I've never apologized for it." "And the attack on you earlier?" Miss Marple asked. "The blow to the head, the stolen journal?" A thin smile crossed Mrs. Pemberton's lips. "Self-inflicted, I'm afraid. A rather theatrical touch, but necessary. I needed that journal back before anyone read the final entries." Cordelia had written everything, her suspicions, her investigation, her plan to confront me and go to the police if I didn't confess. I couldn't allow that to surface. "Where is the journal now?" "Burned in the kitchen stove, along with those damning newspaper clippings you found. You see, Miss Marple, I've had all evening to cover my tracks while you were all gathered in the drawing room, discussing my attack. I even managed to search Cordelia's room again and remove any remaining evidence. Except one piece of evidence you couldn't destroy," Miss Marple said quietly. "Your accomplice, or should I say, your witness. Someone who knew the truth all along and helped you retrieve that journal. Someone who cut the electrical supply while you struck yourself and stole the journal. Someone who had access to the fuse box and knowledge of the house." She turned to look directly at Thomas Weatherby, whose weathered face had gone grey as ash. "Mr. Weatherby, you've been protecting Mrs. Pemberton all along, haven't you? That's why your testimony about seeing a hooded figure in the poison garden was so conveniently vague. That's why you mentioned the missing vial, but never pursued who might have taken it. You've been in love with her for 40 years, haven't you?" The old gardener's shoulders slumped in defeat. "I saw her take the poison that evening," he admitted in a broken voice. "I knew what she planned. And I said nothing because," his voice cracked, "because she promised me that after a decent interval, when the scandal had faded, she might consider. She said she'd been alone so long that perhaps—" "I lied," Mrs. Pemberton said flatly. "Really, Thomas, did you think I would ever marry a gardener? You were useful, that's all. A loyal dog who'd do anything for a kind word and a false hope. The cruelty of it was breathtaking." Thomas Weatherby made a sound like a wounded animal. "You're under arrest," Eleanor said, her voice steady now with certainty. "Both of you. Inspector Davies may not be able to get through until morning, but I'm locking you both in the library until he arrives. Mr. Weatherby, I'm sorry it's come to this, but you're an accessory to murder." "No," Mrs. Pemberton said, and there was something terrible in her smile. "I don't think I'll be locked away like a common criminal. I've been free for 42 years, and I intend to die free." Before anyone could react, she pulled a small vial from her pocket. the very vial Thomas had mentioned missing from the poison garden, and drank its contents in one swift motion. "Sylvia!" "No!" Harriet screamed, lunging forward, but it was too late. Mrs. Pemberton's face contorted as the aconitine took hold, working far faster on an empty stomach than it had on Cordelia Ashworth. She collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing, her eyes still fixed on her half-sister with something that might have been regret or might have been triumph. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether to Harriet or to her victims or to no one at all, they would never know. "I'm sorry I wasn't stronger." Within minutes, she was gone. Chapter 9. The aftermath dawn broke over Greenways Manor with a pale, watery light that seemed to wash the world clean. Miss Marple stood at the window of the Rose Room, her knitting forgotten in her lap, watching as Inspector Davies's motor car finally made its way up the drive, followed by the coroner's vehicle and a police van. The night had been long and terrible. Mrs. Pemberton's body lay in the library, covered with a white sheet. Thomas Weatherby sat in the kitchen under Eleanor's watchful eye, a broken man who had aged 20 years in a single evening. Harriet Pemberton, had retreated to her room and hadn't emerged, though her sobs could be heard through the door. Mrs. Blackwood had stayed with Miss Marple, grateful for the old woman's quiet company, occasionally murmuring prayers or apologies to the empty air. Inspector Davies was a competent man in his 50s, methodical and thorough. Miss Marple gave him her statement, laying out the chain of evidence with the precision of a jeweller setting stones. The poison garden, the missing vial, the newspaper clippings, the investigator's report, the journal that had been destroyed but whose contents Eleanor could partially confirm. "It's a damnable business," Davies said, shaking his head. 42 years that woman lived with murder on her conscience, 3 deaths in Brighton, and now Mrs. Ashworth. 4 victims, and no justice except what she meted out to herself. "Justice takes many forms, Inspector," Miss Marple observed, "though I confess this ending satisfies no one." Thomas Weatherby was arrested as an accessory after the fact, though Miss Marple privately doubted he would serve much time given his age and genuine remorse. The old gardener had been manipulated by a woman who understood how to use hope as a weapon. By noon, the police had finished their preliminary investigation and removed Mrs. Pemberton's body. The house felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of its walls. Eleanor found Miss Marple in the conservatory, where Cordelia's orchids bloomed indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded around them. "I don't know how to thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "Without you, we might never have known the truth. Aunt Cordelia might have been remembered as dying of natural causes, and that monster would have gotten away with it." "She didn't get away with it," Miss Marple replied. "She lived with it for 42 years, trapped in a cage of her own making. Every friendship was false. Every moment of peace was borrowed against a debt she knew would someday come due. In a way, she was in prison all along." "Do you really believe that she suffered?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I think she suffered from fear of discovery, yes." "But remorse? Genuine remorse for her victims? No, I don't believe she felt that. Some people are born without that capacity, my dear. They see others as chess pieces to be moved or removed as necessary. Your aunt called it, in her journal, the queen was always the deadliest piece." "The queen in chess," Eleanor said slowly. "Sylvia Pemberton, the most powerful piece on the board, able to move in any direction, to strike from anywhere. Precisely. And your aunt was a student of strategy, in bridge and in life, She recognized what Mrs. Pemberton was, finally, after all those years. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, surrounded by the gentle fragrance of growing things. "What will happen to Harriet?" Eleanor asked finally. "She kept a terrible secret, but she didn't commit any crime herself. She'll have to live with her choices, as we all do. But she spent 42 years as her sister's shadow, sacrificing any chance at happiness to keep watch over a murderer. That's its own kind of prison. Perhaps now, with the truth revealed, she can finally find some peace." As if summoned by their conversation, Harriet appeared in the doorway of the conservatory. She looked diminished, smaller somehow, as if the burden she'd carried for so long had been holding her upright. And now that it was gone, she was collapsing inward. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you privately?" Eleanor excused herself with a meaningful glance at Miss Marple, who nodded reassuringly. Harriet sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl awaiting judgment. "I owe you an apology. When I held that letter opener last night, I wasn't truly threatening Dorothy. I was threatening myself. I thought if I could just stop the truth from coming out, if I could protect Sylvia one more time." "You'd be protecting the last connection to your family," Miss Marple finished gently. "Even a murderer's family is still family. I understand, my dear. Do you? Can you possibly understand what it's like to love someone you know is a monster? To hope, year after year, that perhaps you were wrong, that perhaps there was some goodness buried deep inside them?" Harriet's voice broke. "I kept telling myself that she'd changed, that the woman who set that fire was young and desperate and afraid, but she hadn't changed. She killed Cordelia as coldly as she killed Edmund Thorne and those poor innocent people in Brighton. And yet you tried to warn Mrs. Ashworth, didn't you? That's what the altered bridge scores meant. You were cheating deliberately, signalling to your sister to be more careful, trying to show Mrs. Ashworth that there were secrets worth keeping hidden." Harriet looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because the pattern of cheating changed after Mrs. Ashworth hired the investigator. Before that, it was Mrs. Pemberton who cheated, using her brooch as a mirror to see the cards. But then suddenly, the errors in scoring benefited you instead. You were trying to draw suspicion to yourself, to protect your sister. You thought if Mrs. Ashworth was focused on your deception, she wouldn't look deeper into Sylvia's past. It didn't work. Cordelia was too clever. She saw through everything eventually." Harriet wiped her eyes. "What will you tell people about me? About my real identity?" Miss Marple considered this. "I will tell the truth, that you are Harriet Pemberton, illegitimate daughter of a gentleman who created a new life for herself as Henrietta Grace. That you made mistakes in protecting your sister, but that you committed no crime yourself beyond the keeping of secrets. What people choose to do with that information is beyond my control, but I suspect Eleanor will speak in your defense." "Why would she do that? I lied to her aunt for decades." "Because," Miss Marple said simply, "Eleanor is her aunt's niece, and Cordelia Ashworth, for all her love of truth, was fundamentally compassionate. She left you money in her will even after discovering your deception. She forgave you. Eleanor will honor that forgiveness." Fresh tears spilled down Harriet's cheeks. "I don't deserve it." "Forgiveness isn't about deserving, my dear. It's about grace. Rather fitting, given your chosen name." Miss Marple patted the younger woman's hand. "Now, I suggest you go to your room, pack your things, and think about what kind of life you want to build from here. You've spent 42 years living in your sister's shadow. It's time to step into the light." After Harriet left, Miss Marple sat alone among the orchids, thinking about the peculiar mathematics of friendship. 3 women, bound together by lies and secrets, circling around a 4th woman who valued truth above all else. It was an equation that could only end in tragedy. Mrs. Blackwood found her there an hour later, looking slightly more composed than she had during the terrible night. "Miss Marple, I'll be leaving tomorrow morning. I can't stay in this house a moment longer than necessary. But I wanted to thank you for listening last night, for not judging me too harshly for my cowardice." "We're all cowards in one way or another," Miss Marple replied. "The question is what we do with our fear. You could have continued hiding the truth about Brighton, but you chose to speak. That took courage, however late it came. Do you think Cordelia would have forgiven me for keeping silent all those years?" Miss Marple thought of the will, the £10,000 left to each of the 3 friends despite their deceptions. "I think she understood that people are complex creatures, Mrs. Blackwood. We're capable of both great courage and great cowardice, sometimes within the same hour. Yes, I believe she forgave you. The question is whether you can forgive yourself." Mrs. Blackwood nodded slowly. "I'll try. I owe her that much." As the sun began to set on that long, terrible day, Miss Marple stood once more at her window, looking out over the gardens that had been the source of both beauty and poison. Eleanor joined her, carrying a tea tray, a gesture of normalcy in a world turned upside down. "Will you stay a few more days?" Eleanor asked. "I could use the company, and the police may have more questions." "I'll stay through the week," Miss Marple agreed. "After that, I should return to St. Mary Mead. My nephew Raymond will be wondering what's become of me." "Miss Marple," Eleanor said hesitantly, "do you think friendship is ever truly possible? Or are we all just using each other for comfort and company, hiding our true selves behind pleasant masks?" It was the question at the heart of everything, and Miss Marple took her time answering. "I think," she said finally, "that true friendship requires truth, but also grace. It requires seeing people as they truly are, flaws and virtues both, and choosing to love them anyway. Your aunt's friends failed her because their friendship was built on deception, but that doesn't mean all friendship is false. It means we must be brave enough to be honest and generous enough to forgive." "That's a tall order," Eleanor said with a sad smile. "Most worthwhile things are, my dear. Most worthwhile things are." Chapter 10. Where Friendship Begins Again. A week had passed since that terrible night, and Greenways Manor was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy, though it would never truly be the same. The police had concluded their investigation, Thomas Weatherby had been released on bail pending trial, and the newspapers had gotten hold of the story. Society Woman's 40-year secret, murder and poison at Greenways Manor. Miss Marple sat in the morning room with Eleanor, helping to sort through Cordelia's correspondence. There were hundreds of letters spanning decades, from friends, family, charitable organizations, botanical societies. Each one a thread in the tapestry of a life lived fully, if ultimately tragically. "I found something yesterday," Eleanor said, pulling a small leather-bound book from her pocket. "Another journal, hidden in a hat-box in Aunt Cordelia's dressing room. It's from much earlier, from the time she first met all 3 women." Miss Marple accepted it carefully and opened to a random page. The handwriting was younger, more energetic than the spidery script of Cordelia's final years. June 1883. met the most extraordinary woman today at a concert in Brighton. Henrietta Grace, a music teacher with the saddest eyes I've ever seen. There's a mystery about her, something hidden and painful. I feel drawn to her somehow, as if we're kindred spirits who've both known loss. I've invited her to tea next week. September 1883, Sylvia is in Brighton. What an unexpected joy to see my childhood friend after so many years. She's changed, though, harder somehow, as if life has carved away all the softness. She says she's been through difficulties but won't elaborate. Still, it's wonderful to have her near again. I've introduced her to Henrietta, and they seem to get along well, though there's an odd tension between them I can't quite identify. November 1883. There was a terrible fire at a boarding house near the seafront. 3 people died. Henrietta was quite affected by it. She seems almost haunted. I've tried to comfort her, but she won't speak of it. Some sorrows, I suppose, are too deep for words. Eleanor's voice was soft. She never knew. All those years, she never suspected what had really happened, what kind of person Sylvia was. She built a friendship on incomplete information. And yet, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that same incomplete information allowed the friendship to flourish for 40 years. Sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. It was only when your aunt sought the complete truth that tragedy followed. Are you saying she shouldn't have investigated? That she should have let sleeping dogs lie? Not at all. I'm saying that truth has a price, and your aunt was willing to pay it. She could have ignored her suspicions, continued playing bridge with her friends, died peacefully in her bed some day with all the secrets intact. But that wasn't who she was. She valued justice over comfort, truth over convenience. That's admirable, even if it cost her everything. There was a knock at the door, and Harriet Pemberton entered, dressed for travel. She had aged visibly in the past week, the lines around her eyes deeper, her hair seeming greyer than before. "I'm leaving for London this afternoon," she announced. "I've let my cottage in the village and taken a small flat near Bloomsbury. I thought I might try teaching music again. There's a girls' school that needs an instructor." "I think that's wonderful," Eleanor said warmly. "Aunt Cordelia always said you had a gift for teaching." Harriet's eyes filled with tears. "Eleanor, I don't deserve your kindness. I deceived your aunt for so long, and she forgave you," Eleanor interrupted gently. "She left you £10,000, Miss Pemberton. That's not the action of someone who held a grudge. She understood that you were a victim too, in your own way. A victim of your sister's cruelty and your father's rejection. I should have been stronger. I should have stopped Sylvia years ago." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a decisive click. "My dear Miss Pemberton, we could all shoot ourselves to death if we chose to. Yes, you made mistakes. Yes, you could have acted differently. But you were young and frightened and alone, facing a sister who was willing to kill to protect her secrets. You survived the only way you knew how. Now you have a chance to live differently. I suggest you take it." Harriet nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "Before I go, I wanted to give you something." She pulled an envelope from her bag and handed it to Eleanor. "I've written down everything I know about Sylvia's crimes. Dates, details, the names of the people who died in Brighton. It's not enough to convict her now, of course, but perhaps it will help those families find some closure. The landlady who died, Mrs. Patterson, had a daughter who still lives in Brighton. She deserves to know what really happened to her mother. I'll make sure she receives it," Eleanor promised. After Harriet left, the 2 women returned to their sorting. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, until Eleanor spoke again. "Miss Marple, Do you think my aunt's title was correct? Does friendship truly end where inheritance begins?" Miss Marple considered the question, her needles clicking steadily. "I think your aunt was observing a particular truth about a particular set of relationships. Mrs. Pemberton's friendship was always transactional. What could she gain? What could she protect? What could she take? When the will revealed that she wouldn't inherit as much as she expected, her mask slipped entirely. But that wasn't friendship ending so much as the revelation that it had never truly existed in the first place. And Mrs. Blackwood? Harriet? Mrs. Blackwood kept silent out of fear, which is human if not heroic, but she genuinely cared for your aunt, I believe. As for Harriet, hers was perhaps the most genuine friendship of all, despite its foundation in deception. She cared for Cordelia, even as she watched over her sister. It was a complicated, twisted sort of caring, but real nonetheless. So where does friendship truly end? Friendship ends, Miss Marple said slowly, where honesty ends. Not honesty about facts necessarily, but honesty about who we are at our core. Your aunt's friends presented false versions of themselves, not just false histories, but false characters. That's where the friendship failed, long before the inheritance question arose. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then where does friendship begin? Miss Marple smiled, and it transformed her lined face into something almost youthful. Friendship begins where acceptance begins, where we see another person clearly, their virtues and their faults, and choose to care for them anyway. It begins with small acts of kindness, with listening, with being present. It begins, my dear Eleanor, exactly where we are right now. The younger woman's eyes widened. Are you saying? I'm saying that you and I have become friends this week, I hope. Not because of inheritance or social obligation, but because we've been honest with each other. You've shown me your grief and your anger, your strength and your vulnerability, and I've tried to offer you truth, even when it was uncomfortable. That's the beginning of real friendship. Eleanor reached across and squeezed Miss Marple's hand. Thank you for everything, for solving the mystery, yes, but more than that, for staying, for listening, for helping me understand. Mrs. Blackwood appeared in the doorway, also dressed for departure. Forgive the interruption. Eleanor, I wanted to say goodbye. I'm returning to my sister's house in Kent. I'll be selling my cottage here. I can't bear to stay in the village after everything that's happened. I understand, Eleanor said, rising, but Dorothy, before you go, I want you to know that Aunt Cordelia forgave you, and so do I. What happened wasn't your fault. You were threatened by a dangerous woman, and you survived. That took courage. Mrs. Blackwood's plump face crumpled with emotion. You're very kind. Too kind, perhaps. But I'll try to believe you. She turned to Miss Marple. And you, Miss Marple. Thank you for uncovering the truth. It was terrible, yes, but better than living with lies. After she had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting with a thoughtful expression. You've been very generous with forgiveness, Eleanor. Your aunt would be proud. Aunt Cordelia taught me that holding grudges only poisons the holder. Sylvia Pemberton spent 42 years holding on to her secrets, and it turned her into a monster. I won't do the same with anger. Life's too short. Very wise for someone so young. I'm 39, Miss Marple, hardly young. My dear girl, you're a child compared to me. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And you have your whole life ahead of you. What will you do with this house? With your inheritance? Eleanor looked around the morning room. with its pale yellow walls and comfortable furniture. I thought I might turn part of it into a retreat for women who need a fresh start. Women like Harriet, who've made mistakes or faced hardships and need a safe place to rebuild. Aunt Cordelia loved this house, but she also loved helping people. This seems like a way to honor both. A perfect tribute, Miss Marple approved. And will you continue your aunt's poison garden? Absolutely not. That's being torn out next week and replaced with roses. Beautiful, harmless roses in every color imaginable. Let this place be known for beauty that heals, not beauty that kills. The following morning, Raymond arrived in his motor car to collect his aunt. The rain had finally cleared, and autumn sunshine painted the gardens in gold and amber. Eleanor walked Miss Marple to the car, carrying her small travelling bag. "Will you come back and visit?" Eleanor asked. "Once the retreat is established, once life has returned to normal." "Normal is a relative term, my dear, but yes, I'd be delighted to visit. And you must come to St. Mary Mead some time. It's much quieter than Greenways Manor, I assure you. We haven't had a proper murder in at least 6 months." Eleanor laughed despite herself. "Is that the standard measurement of excitement in your village?" "Among other things. We also measure excitement by how many cakes Mrs. Bantry manages to burn at the church fete, and how many times the vicar uses the wrong hymn number." Miss Marple's expression grew more serious. "But truly, Eleanor, if you ever need to talk, to share a burden, or simply to have tea with a friend, my door is always open. That means more than you know." Raymond had loaded the luggage and was waiting patiently by the car. Miss Marple climbed in, settling her knitting bag beside her, and looked back at the manor one final time. It stood against the autumn sky like a beautiful lie, its elegant facade hiding the tragedy that had unfolded within. But Eleanor would change that, Miss Marple thought. She would fill it with new stories, new friendships built on honesty rather than deception. As they drove away down the tree-lined drive, Miss Marple reflected on the case. 4 women, bound together by friendship and secrets. 3 murders in Brighton, 1 murder at Greenways Manor. A lifetime of deception, ending in poison and confession. But also, and this was important, 1 young woman choosing forgiveness over bitterness. 1 illegitimate daughter finally stepping out of shadow into light. 1 guilty secret keeper finding the courage to speak truth. And 1 old woman from St. Mary Mead making a new friend in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Penny for your thoughts, Aunt Jane?" Raymond asked as they turned onto the main road. "I was thinking," Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythmic clicking, "about the title of this sad affair. Friendship ends where inheritance begins. But I've decided it's incomplete." "Oh, how would you complete it?" Miss Marple smiled softly, watching the Sussex countryside roll past. "Friendship ends where inheritance begins, but it begins again where truth and forgiveness meet. That's the real ending to this story. Not murder and poison and death, but the possibility of something better growing from the ruins." "That's very philosophical, Aunt Jane. Murder often is, my dear. Murder often is." As they drove toward home, Miss Marple thought of Cordelia Ashworth, who had valued truth above comfort and paid the ultimate price. She thought of the 3 women who had called themselves friends while hiding behind masks. And she thought of Eleanor, beginning the hard work of building genuine connections in a world that often preferred pretty lies to difficult truths. Friendship, Miss Marple reflected, was rather like her knitting. It required patience, attention to detail, and the willingness to unpick mistakes and start again. But when done properly, with care and honesty, it created something both beautiful and lasting. The manor disappeared behind them, but its lessons travelled with her, lessons about truth and lies, about love and betrayal, about the price of secrets and the value of forgiveness. And in St. Mary Mead, life would continue its gentle pace until the next mystery presented itself. Because there was always another mystery, Miss Marple knew. Human nature guaranteed it. But there was also always another chance for genuine friendship, for honest connection, for choosing truth over comfort. And that, perhaps, was the most important mystery of all. Not who committed the murder, but how we choose to live after the truth is revealed. The end. Friendship ends where inheritance begins. A Miss Jane Marple mystery epilogue. 6 months later, Eleanor Ashworth opened the Greenways Women's Retreat to its first residents. Among them was a young woman fleeing an abusive marriage, a widow trying to rebuild after bankruptcy, and a teacher who had lost her position due to scandal. Harriet Pemberton sent a donation from London, along with a note. In memory of Cordelia, who believed in second chances even when she had every reason not to. Mrs. Blackwood visited once, planted a rosebush in Cordelia's memory, and never returned, but she wrote letters staying connected from a safe distance. And Miss Jane Marple received regular correspondence from Eleanor, sharing news of the retreat's success and occasional mysteries of the human heart that required no investigation, only understanding. The poison garden was gone, replaced by roses, but the lesson remained, that beauty and danger often grow from the same root, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference.